Thank you very much. What I would like to do today is, why are we engaging ourselves with crimes of the past, with injustices and with historical wrongs? My interest and my work is focusing really on the role of history in contemporary politics. And I think that Jan Gross's, if I will share, I don't know if I agree or not, I wouldn't predict what would happen with the book, but I think that it's probably impossible to match the impact that neighbors had on Polish identity. Such a profound importance that changes the self-perception of a nation is not something that, it's a bar that is not to be lightly emulated. So the question is, that I want to ask today is, why is it that these issues are so engaging to us? Why is history not just relegated to the dustbin of history, as we used to say, right? Why has it become such a hot political issue? And I would obviously suggest two very brief comments. Two, I won't even develop those. One is that history actually constructs the national identity. And in this way, the work that Gross presents to us is an important factor in constructing the Polish national identity. This is why it's, I think, profoundly contemporary rather than just a historical work. Or put it differently, we can say that who we were is who we are. And therefore, the struggles that we have over history is the struggle really about our contemporary identity. I think that the ability to use ethnocracy in this auditorium with this detachment increases my admiration that much higher. The main difficulty, and that speaks directly to the questions of ethnocracy or to the questions of human rights and individual rights versus group rights and nationality, is what I titled or named Neo-Enlightenment. The problem of Enlightenment obviously was to try and bring forth the individual as opposed to the group. But just effacing the role of the group in one's life was not satisfactory, isn't satisfactory. And therefore what we have in our public life and in our understanding of public perception is we have a core of individual liberal rights, and those are envelopes with cultural and social rights, our existence as social beings rather than as individuals. That talks about group rights, about local traditions and preferences, and when we deal with issues of history in that regard, is that what we have is that we negotiate our social identity and our individual identity. And when we deal with history, it's not just necessarily one perspective that we have, but we have to look at it from different perspectives. So, the importance that I see in history, in the role of history too, and why our engagements with historical injustices is because it enables us to deal with redress. But redress, which has become a profoundly central topic in contemporary politics, and I'll show you immediately what I'm trying to do, is a framework for integrating universal rights with group identity. It's really to try and create a balance between those commitments that we have to the individual, those what we call human rights, and those commitments that we have as members of a national group that actually conflicts and presents us, puts us in a situation which creates a conflict with our other identity. So I would like to point out very briefly why it matters and how it relates to human rights, to democracy, and to conflict resolutions. I will say a couple of words about the forms of redress and how they work. And then I will get to historical commissions, to the role of historical commissions. Okay, so what is redress? Here you see I draw a whole spectrum between restorative and retributive redress. We have here the voluntary side, which is reparations, restitution, historical commissions, and apologies. These are nations, countries around the world that engage in redress for their own wrongs, but do it from a voluntary perspective. And on the retributive, the imposed side, we have trials, international tribunals, the International Criminal Court, and lustration. Again, on each of them deserves a discussion, and my apologies for running through that so quickly. But in between those, you have the Truth Commissions and the South Africa Truth Commission, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is so central. And all of these forms of redress are so significant precisely because of the alternative, which Jans Grosses showed us today, and this is vengeance. There's always in forms in societies in points of transitions is you have this as opposed to all of that. Ordinary transition as opposed to vengeance. And it is this place where I think why that has become so important to us. So, what we have in redress is, in all of those lists that I showed you, we have redress that goes beyond, that is structural, it goes beyond the transitional justice, the redress. It is structural, it addresses the various components of society, it's historical, and it is concerns with group rights. That's what I want to argue, that redress is wider than the rapidly growing field of transitional justice. And it addresses historical crimes long term, and in that regard I think that where I would come is really between Engel and Gross in that regard, is how do we try and form whether the redress is something that is a long term or whether it is something that is much shorter and is specifically to a transitional society, that it begins and ends and without integrating the long process. Now, in order for us to, I just want to highlight that it addresses the wrongs and the injustices not only in post-World War situation, obviously, but it's really a global phenomenon which goes all the way from indigenous peoples, post-colonial societies, and really those are forms that we see continuously in different societies around the world. In this regard, it's a universal culture. And here we come to what I said, that trying to bridge the universal commitments, whether it is to human rights or to multiculturalism or to sensitivity to ethnic, to others, to multiculturalism, and the local traditions, the local, and here I come to the fears, which I think is very important as a drive, which is not only in a transitional society, not only in a society which seems seen from the outside under risk, but I find it difficult to think of societies that are not afraid of whether immediate or unrealistic from the outside perspective. So what redress does is mediating rights-based claims and the realities of conflict resolution, and it injects considerations of morality into international relations. In that regard, what I think is important is that those things, those soft components, not just what would call realism in international relations, but these soft aspects are really a component of realpolitik. Human rights in that regard is a component of realpolitik. Now, in that regard, this is not just a soft perspective of human rights activists. It is becoming, it's a process. What we have is, and I won't read it to you, but these are few of them UN instruments that actually try and bring the issues of redress as a human right. And in that regard, I think that it is important for us to remember that this is becoming an international norm, and it's not becoming an international norm because it is imposed from anyone, because it is rather because you have a situation where addressing the pain of the past is an important component of contemporary existence. And let me make here a very small and short, quick suggestion. You see, the Freedom House, for instance, has different indicators for democracy. It has election, freedom of speech, civil society, etc. What I would like to suggest, and what I'm going to show you in a minute, just in 1 minute, is that redress that addressing the wrongs of the past is becoming an increasingly important component of developing democracies. Indeed, if you would look how this has developed over the last 3 decades, right, from the 70s on, we have a couple of, about 60 countries or more that have become democracies. We can see that those that became democracies in the 70s never addressed the past. Then in the 80s, we have a very partial redress, primarily in Latin America. In Eastern Europe, we have diverse form of redress, and then in South Africa, a new norm. And now all of those various ways in which redress of the past become important for a democracy is really manifested in part, and I would say not in small part, in one of the most successful ways that is done, not small part to Grosser's book on Yudvabne, I think, especially in the way that I'll come to in a minute with the IPN. So I think that this is what I'm trying to suggest here, that we have really international trends that are important for the political cultures that are developing, both nationally and internationally, and that this kinds of work, of historical work, is becoming an important anchor in those transformations. Now, before I become too emotional about those issues, let me say that all of the redress is by and large symbolic. And I think that I've spoken here about some of those aspects, but let me give you just a statement, and I'd be happy to answer if anybody's interested in it, in specifics. But basically the situation is that even the most extensive redress, which is Germany, Israel, Jews, is, in terms of the sums that were involved, where symbolically, when you compare it to either to the crime or to the ability of the perpetrators to pay, that fundamentally the achievement of redress is to balance the identity, to create new relationship, not to actually lead to redistribution. So obviously the question is, why is redress attractive both to victims and perpetrators? And in some ways my construction of the statement is the answer, because it enables new relationship, I think, because it is symbolic. And I think in this regard words are very important, images are important, our reciprocal views are, and so we have the role of apologies, which again I think plays a dramatic role in these cases. Now, another way in which this is being done is through historical commissions. We are very familiar in Israel about historical commissions, especially in the aftermath of the Cold War, where there were over 40 commissions that dealt in each particular country with the role of a particular state with the Holocaust. There have been historical commissions in numerous places. Some of them are bilateral, others are national. Clearly, the Swiss commissions are some of the more famous, but there are also commissions between France and Germany, between Germany and Poland, there's Germany and the Czech, the Sudeten. I'm not going to describe any of that. But there are also some missing historical commissions that are extremely important for complicated political reasons nowadays. I'm just mentioning two of them. The whole issue of Turkey becoming a member of the EU, in some respect, is dependent on an agreement about the definition of the Armenian genocide, yes or no. So this is an incredibly important topic which historians are at the core of it, and which the kind of history that we've heard about today is essential to that kind of formulation. And obviously East Asia, Japan and the legacy of Japanese colonialism, probably the only place in the world today that history can actually instigate or lead to a global conflict, much more than just local between a couple of or regional rather than local. The Institute of National Remembrance, to the relief of some of you, would bring us closer to the topic of today. I think, as it is defined in Poland, right, you have the preserving document, access and public education, but also prosecuting crimes against the Polish nation. And I think that the IVN actually, and here I'm on softer ground since I'm really not a specialist at anything to do with Poland, But I think this is a very interesting model that is different than what we have seen or what I'm familiar with in other countries. The idea, it's not a truth commission, it's not a historical commission on its own, but it actually addresses several components, including the idea that you need to bring people to justice. So if we recall the spectrum between retributive and voluntary and restorative justice, the IPN has done exactly that specifically, obviously with regard to the inner results of Jedwabne, where after the criminal procedure and the historical research, you had also the apologies and the recognition, which have, and I will accept any other judgment, but I think has taken important steps in reconfiguring the self-perceptions of Poland as a nation and its responsibility and its willing to engage the past. So we have heard that, but let me just go over it and by way of concluding. I think that the idea of the motives that Professor Gross attributes to Poles, obviously the loot, anti-Semitism, but I find most impressive and most interesting are actually the fear of the evil within the Polish society, the evil of and the fear of confronting the self, which is at the end of the day the most difficult component. And I think that in this regard, I don't know, David, if they would like more Jan's perspective in terms of the self-perceptions, but I think it is extremely helpful. I think that is extremely helpful in terms of the Polish perspective, not only in terms of the Polish Jewish perspective. If I were to talk more about the content itself, I think that what is most interesting in that, and I'm doing a lot of studying of comparative genocide, ethnic cleansing, etc., is perhaps how unexceptional, not how exceptional, but how unexceptional those relationships are when you compare them. The violence is pervasive in so many different societies. So the question for me is, when we leave this book and this session, is how will Poland internalize the post-war violence? Thank you very much.